I found out I was pregnant the same day my husband filed for divorce. The pregnancy test was still in my hand when the process server knocked on my door. 2 pink lines. 2 words on a folded document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I stood there in my bathrobe, one hand pressed to my stomach, the other holding papers that told me my husband of 3 years no longer wanted to be my husband at all. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just read the header 3 times, as if reading it slower would change what it said. My name is Elena Marsh. I was 31 years old, for minutes pregnant by my own knowledge, and about to become a single mother before I even had the chance to tell the father. What I didn't know that morning, what I wouldn't know for 9 more months, was why he'd done it. And when the truth finally came out, it would break me in a way divorce papers never could. But let me back up. Because before I was the woman crying on her bathroom floor with a positive test in one hand and a lawsuit in the other, I was just a girl who believed in love a little too much. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew whose porch light was broken and whose marriage was too. My parents had one of the good ones, 34 years and counting. My dad still bringing my mom coffee in bed every morning. I grew up thinking that was normal. I grew up thinking that was what I'd get too. I was practical by nature. I became a physical therapist because I liked fixing things that were broken bodies, mostly, but I liked the idea of taking something in pain and making it whole again. I had a small apartment, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a 5-year plan that did not include heartbreak. I wasn't looking for anyone when I met Daniel. That's usually how it goes, isn't it? I was at my cousin's engagement party, hiding by the dessert table because I didn't know anyone, and a tall man in a gray suit asked me if the tiramisu was any good. I told him I hadn't tried it because I was too busy avoiding small talk. He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and said, "Then let's avoid it together." Daniel Cole was 34, sharp-jawed, quick-witted, and worked in commercial real estate for his family's company. He had that particular confidence that comes from never really being told no. But with me in those early days, he was soft. Attentive. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk after hearing it once. He texted good morning every single day for the first year. My friends warned me gently, the way friends do. "He's a little intense," my best friend Priya said once. "He wants to know where you are a lot." I brushed it off. I told her that was just what caring looked like. I didn't yet understand the difference between care and control, a lesson I would learn far too late and at far too high a cost. For the first 2 years, it really did feel like a fairy tale. Daniel proposed on a hiking trail we'd taken on our 3rd date, at the same overlook where he'd first told me he loved me. He'd hidden the ring in his backpack for 3 days, waiting for a weekend with clear skies. When I said yes, he actually cried, and I remember thinking, this is a man who isn't afraid to feel things. I didn't yet know how selective those feelings would turn out to be. The wedding was small, 60 guests, a barn venue with string lights, my father crying through his toast. Daniel's mother, Vivian, hugged me tight and whispered that she'd never seen her son this happy. His father, Richard, was harder to read, a quiet, watchful man who ran coal properties with an iron grip and seemed to measure everyone by what they could offer the family name. I told myself that was just how businessmen were. The first year of marriage was, if I'm honest, close to perfect. We renovated a fixer-upper together, arguing over paint colors and laughing about it after. Daniel would surprise me with weekend trips. He learned to make my grandmother's pierogi recipe because I mentioned once that I missed them. I used to tell Priya that I'd won some kind of lottery, that I'd found the one man who actually listened. Looking back now, I can see the story a little differently. I can see that Daniel's attentiveness was, in part, a kind of surveillance dressed up as devotion. But at the time, I only saw a man who loved me with his whole chest, and I loved him back the same way. That love was real. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was real, which is exactly why what came next hurt as much as it did. The cracks didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way water gets into a foundation, slow, quiet, in places you don't think to check. It started with his phone. Daniel had always been private about it, and I'd never thought much of it, but in our 2nd year he started taking calls in the garage, door shut, voice low. When I asked, he said it was work, a difficult acquisition his father was pushing him to close. I believed him because I had no reason not to. Then there were the weekends he vanished for site visits that stretched into 2-day trips with spotty cell service. There was the night I found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket from a city he'd told me he never visited that month. When I brought it up, he didn't get defensive, he got sad, which somehow disarmed me more. He said his father was drowning him in work he couldn't talk about yet, that there were things happening at Cole Properties he wasn't allowed to discuss. He asked me to trust him. I did. His mother, Vivian, started calling me more often during that stretch, always fishing gently. Is everything all right between you two? Is Daniel eating? Is he sleeping? Questions that felt less like small talk and more like she was checking on something she already suspected was cracking. Priya was the one who finally said it out loud over wine one night. Elena, you've made more excuses for him in the last 6 months than in the 2 years before that. I remember getting defensive. I remember saying marriage takes work, that every couple goes through rough patches, that I wasn't going to give up on my husband over a hotel receipt and some late nights. I didn't know yet that I was defending a stranger. I'd been feeling off for almost 2 weeks, tired in a way sleep didn't fix, queasy in the mornings, my body just slightly unfamiliar to me. I told myself it was stress. Daniel had been distant for a month by then, sleeping in the guest room, so his late calls wouldn't wake me, working later, saying less. On a Tuesday morning, I bought a test on my way home from a run, mostly to rule it out. I remember sitting on the edge of the bathtub, watching the little window, telling myself it would be negative, that I'd laugh about the scare later. It wasn't negative. 2 lines. Clear, unmistakable, permanent. I sat there for a long moment with my hand pressed flat against my stomach, feeling something crack open in my chest, not fear exactly, not yet. Something closer to wonder. I thought about how I'd tell Daniel. I thought about whether the distance between us over the last month might dissolve the second I showed him that little plastic stick. I let myself hope, for maybe 4 whole minutes, that this baby might be the thing that brought my husband back to me. Then the doorbell rang. I opened the door, still holding the test, not thinking to hide it, and a stranger in a blazer handed me a manila envelope and asked me to sign for it. I remember the pen feeling too light in my hand. I remember not understanding, for a full 10 seconds, what I was looking at. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Petitioner, Daniel R. Cole. Respondent, Elena M. Cole. I called him 4 times before he picked up. When he finally did, his voice was flat, rehearsed, like he'd practiced this call in a mirror. He said it wasn't working, that he'd been unhappy for a long time, that he thought it was better to end things cleanly before we grew to resent each other. He said his lawyer would be in touch. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask if I was sitting down. He did not give me a single real reason. I told him I was pregnant. There was a silence on the other end of that phone that I have never, in the years since, been able to fully describe. It wasn't shock exactly. It was something closer to dread, like I'd handed him a problem he already knew was coming, just sooner than he'd planned for. He said, quietly, I need to call you back, and he hung up before I could say another word. He didn't call back that day. Or the next. I don't remember driving to Priya's apartment. I remember arriving on her doorstep with the pregnancy test in one hand and the divorce papers crumpled in the other, and I remember her face when she opened the door and understood, in one look, that both of those objects belonged to the same terrible day. She didn't ask questions. She just pulled me inside and held on to me while I came apart on her kitchen floor. I want to be honest about what that grief felt like, because I think people who haven't lived it imagine it as one clean wave of sadness. It wasn't. It was sadness and rage and humiliation, all braided together, taking turns choosing which one got to be loudest. 1 minute I was sobbing because I still loved him. The next I was furious that he could look at a pregnant wife over the phone and say, I need to call you back. Then I was terrified, doing math in my head about rent and insurance and whether physical therapists got maternity leave at my clinic. I called my mother that night. She didn't say much. My mother has never been a woman of many words in a crisis. She just got in her car and drove 3 hours to sit with me. She held my hand and said the thing I needed to hear and didn't yet believe. You are going to be all right. And so is this baby. I promise you that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the guest bed. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the room that still smelled like him, with my hand on my stomach, talking quietly to a baby who was smaller than a grain of rice, telling it that whatever happened next, it was already loved more than it would ever know. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's lawyer sent cold, procedural emails while Daniel himself went almost entirely silent. When we did finally speak, a stilted quarter hour in a coffee shop neither of us wanted to be in, he told me, without quite meeting my eyes, that he wasn't ready to be a father. That the timing was wrong. That there were things going on in his life he couldn't explain to me yet, and that the kindest thing he could do was let me go before those things caught up to both of us. I asked him directly if he wanted me to end the pregnancy. I remember watching his face very closely when I asked, because some small, foolish part of me still needed to know if there was any version of this man that wanted to fight for us. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that has to be your decision. Not mine. I made it in about 4 seconds, sitting right there across from him. I'm keeping this baby, I told him. Whether you're in this family or not. The house sold faster than either of us expected. Daniel, it turned out, was eager to liquidate, another detail I filed away without understanding yet. I took my half of the proceeds and found a small 2-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from Priya, close enough that she could show up with soup on 10 minutes notice, which she did, often. I went back to work at the clinic full-time, treating knees and shoulders while my own body quietly built a person. I painted the second bedroom a soft sage green on a Saturday afternoon, by myself, because I didn't want to wait for anyone's permission to start imagining a nursery. My mother drove up most weekends. My father, a man of few words, showed up one Saturday with a crib he'd assembled in his garage and simply said, "Figured you'd need this," before hugging me longer than he ever had. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I sat in my car outside the apartment because I couldn't face walking in alone. There were moments in the grocery store, standing in front of baby formula I didn't understand yet, where the reality of doing this by myself hit me so hard I had to grip the cart to stay upright. But there was something else growing alongside the grief, a kind of stubborn, quiet strength I hadn't known I had. I started going to a prenatal yoga class alone and liked it. I started cooking for one and finding I didn't mind the quiet. Slowly, I began to realize that starting over didn't mean I had failed. It meant I had survived something, and I was still standing. The second trimester should have been easier. Instead, at 22 weeks, a routine scan flagged my blood pressure as elevated, and my doctor started saying words like preeclampsia risk and monitor closely. I remember sitting alone in the exam room, no husband's hand to hold, taking notes on my phone because I was too afraid I'd forget something important. I was put on modified bed rest for stretches at a time. I had to cut my hours at the clinic, which meant cutting my income right when I needed it most. Priya started sleeping over twice a week, just so someone would be there if something went wrong in the night. My mother took an extended leave from her own job to stay with me for a month, cooking, doing laundry, sitting beside me during the appointments where they'd check the baby's heartbeat and I'd hold my breath until I heard it. There were dark nights during that stretch, nights I let myself wonder what would happen if something went wrong and there was no one but Priya's number in my emergency contacts. I called Daniel exactly once during that time, at 26 weeks, after a scare that sent me to the hospital for observation. He didn't pick up. He texted 2 hours later, "Everything okay?" 2 words. 2 hours late. I didn't answer. What carried me through wasn't him. It was my mother's hand smoothing my hair back at 2 a.m. It was Priya learning to braid hair just so she'd have something to do with her hands while we watched my numbers on the monitor. It was the sound of a heartbeat, steady and fast and entirely its own, reminding me every single time that whatever else was falling apart, this baby was still fighting to be here. So was I. The support that carried me through those months didn't come from where I expected. It was Vivian, Daniel's mother, who showed up one Thursday afternoon with a bag of maternity clothes and an apology in her eyes she didn't quite know how to voice. She told me, sitting stiffly at my kitchen table, that she didn't understand what her son was doing, that it wasn't the way he was raised, and that whatever happened between us, she wasn't going to disappear from her grandchild's life. She started coming by every other week after that, quiet visits, casseroles left in the fridge, never asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. It was my coworker Marcus, a fellow PT at the clinic, who quietly rearranged the schedule so I never had to lift a heavy patient during my 3rd trimester without help, who never made a comment about it, who just did it. It was my landlord, an older woman named Ruth who lived on the 1st floor, who started leaving a thermos of ginger tea on my doorstep on the mornings she heard me getting sick through the thin apartment walls, with a note that just said, "Hang in there, honey." And it was Priya, more than anyone Priya, who took an entire week of her vacation time just to drive me to appointments, who researched pediatricians with me at midnight, who held my hand through every needle and every scan and never once made me feel like a burden for needing her. I learned something in those months I hadn't fully understood before. Family isn't only the people who share your name. Sometimes it's the people who simply show up, again and again, without being asked. It was Vivian, in the end, who let something slip, not out of malice, I think, but out of a mother's guilt that had been eating at her for months. We were folding tiny onesies at my kitchen table when she went quiet, then said, almost to herself, he should never have let his father talk him into this. I stopped folding. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated a long time, torn, I could see, between loyalty to her son and something that looked a lot like conscience. Finally, she told me. Cole Properties, it turned out, had been in serious financial trouble for over a year, over-leveraged on 2 commercial developments that had stalled out during a downturn. Richard, Daniel's father, had been quietly negotiating a merger with a rival firm to keep the company from collapsing, a merger that came with a condition. The other family, the Whitfields, wanted their daughter married into the Cole name to formalize the alliance the old-fashioned way, the way Richard himself had built half his career doing business. Daniel, Vivian said, had been given an ultimatum: end his marriage quietly, keep the company afloat, secure his future in the family business, or watch everything his father built collapse and take the extended family's finances down with it. I sat there, one hand pressed to my very pregnant stomach, absorbing the idea that my marriage hadn't ended because Daniel stopped loving me. It had ended because his father put a company on one side of a scale and me on the other, and Daniel, my Daniel, who used to text me good morning every day for a year, had let the scale tip without ever telling me the truth. I didn't know whether that made it better or infinitely worse. I confronted Daniel 3 days later, meeting him again at the same coffee shop, my belly now impossible to ignore between us. I told him what his mother had told me. I watched the color drain out of his face, watched him realize the secret he'd been carrying alone for a year had finally cracked open. He didn't deny it. That was almost the worst part, he didn't even try. He put his head in his hands and told me everything. The merger, the ultimatum, the Whitfield daughter named Caroline he'd been forced into a courtship with for appearances, a courtship he swore, looking me dead in the eye, he had never wanted and never touched. He said his father told him a pregnant wife would only complicate the timeline, that Richard had pressured him to file before I even found out, banking on the idea that I wouldn't yet know I was carrying his child. He said he hated himself every day since. He said he'd wanted to tell me 100 times and lost his nerve every single one of them. You let me think you didn't want us, I said, and my voice broke on the last word. You let me grieve a man who was never even gone. You just let me believe I wasn't enough to fight for. He reached for my hand across the table. I pulled it back. You don't get to cry about this, I told him. Not yet. Not until I understand what you're actually going to do about it. He said he was done with his father's ultimatums, done hiding, done choosing a company over his own child. I wanted, so badly, to believe him. But I had learned, over the last 7 months, not to build my safety on Daniel's words anymore. Only on his actions. And so far, his actions had cost me almost everything. Knowing the truth didn't fix anything overnight. If anything, it complicated things further. Daniel told me he was walking away from coal properties entirely, refusing the merger, refusing his father's terms. But refusing his father's terms meant refusing his father's money too, and Richard, I would learn, did not take betrayal quietly. Within 2 weeks, Daniel had been locked out of every company account, his name stripped from projects he'd spent a decade building, his access to the family's shared accounts frozen. He called me, shaken in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him before, telling me his father had essentially disowned him, cutting him off financially, legally distancing the family business from any association with him. Even reportedly telling relatives that Daniel was no longer welcome at family gatherings until he came to his senses. For the first time since our marriage began, Daniel was searching, not for me, not yet, not directly, but for a version of himself that existed outside his father's shadow. He took a small apartment across town, started working with a lawyer of his own, began quietly rebuilding contacts. He'd need to start something independent. He didn't ask to come back into my life. He said he understood he hadn't earned that yet. He asked, instead, if he could simply be there for the birth, if I would let him. I told him I'd think about it. I told him actions, not promises. And in the back of my mind, a quieter search was happening too, my own. A search for whether I still recognized, underneath all of it, the man I had once loved so completely. I wasn't sure yet what I would find. I went into labor on a Sunday morning, 3 days past my due date, with a contraction so sharp it doubled me over while I was making tea. Priya drove me to the hospital with my mother following behind in her own car, both of them more nervous than I was, strangely. I think some deep, primal calm had settled over me the moment it actually started. Labor lasted 14 hours. I won't pretend it was easy or graceful or anything like the calm water birth photos I'd seen in my prenatal class. It was hard and long, and there were moments in hour 11 where I looked at my mother and told her I couldn't do it anymore, and she held my face in both hands and said, "Yes, you can. You've been doing the hardest part alone for 7 months. This is just the last mile." Daniel was in the waiting room. I'd agreed to let him be in the building, though not in the delivery room, a boundary I needed, and one he respected without argument. Vivian sat with him the whole time, I was told later, her hand on her son's knee while he paced. At 9:47 p.m., my daughter was born, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the entire room. I remember the nurse placing her on my chest and every single hard month of that pregnancy simply dissolving, replaced by this small, furious, perfect person who was entirely, unmistakably mine. I named her Grace. Because that's what had carried me here. Not luck, not romance, but grace, given to me by my mother, by Priya, by strangers who left tea on my doorstep. Daniel was allowed in briefly, an hour later. I watched him look at his daughter for the first time, watched him cry the same unguarded tears he'd cried at our wedding, and for one quiet moment, I let myself feel something other than anger. I didn't know yet what that feeling meant. I just let it exist. The first months of Grace's life were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and a kind of exhaustion I hadn't known a human body could survive. I went back to work part-time when Grace was 10 weeks old, dropping her at my mother's on the days she could take her. At a daycare Vivian quietly helped cover the cost of on the others. Daniel showed up during that time, not perfectly, not always on time, but consistently. He took Grace 2 evenings a week once she was old enough, learned to swaddle her, learned which cry meant hungry and which meant tired, texted me photos of her sleeping on his chest with captions like, "She has your stubborn chin." We were not back together. I want to be clear about that. I had drawn a very firm line between co-parenting and reconciliation, and I held it, even on the nights it would have been easier not to. I built a life in those months that belonged entirely to me and Grace. I found a rhythm, mornings at the clinic, afternoons with my daughter, evenings that were quiet and small and mine. I stopped waiting for anyone to complete the picture. For the first time since the divorce papers arrived on the same day as those 2 pink lines, I felt something like solid ground under my feet. Daniel, meanwhile, had started his own small real estate consulting firm, independent of his father entirely, taking on modest clients, rebuilding from nothing. He told me once, dropping Grace off, that it was the first work he'd ever done that felt like it was actually his. I told him I was glad. I meant it. But I still wasn't sure what role, if any, he was meant to play in the rest of my story. 9 months after Grace was born, 9 months, almost to the day, from the morning the divorce papers arrived, Daniel asked to meet me somewhere other than a doorstep handoff. He asked if we could talk, really talk, without Grace between us as a buffer. I almost said no. Part of me had built a careful piece out of the distance between us, and I was afraid of what disturbing it might cost. But another part of me, the part that still remembered a man who used to text good morning every day for a year, wanted to hear what he had to say. We met at a park near my apartment, Grace at my mother's for the afternoon. Daniel looked different than he had at the coffee shop 9 months earlier, thinner, more tired, but steadier somehow, like a man who'd been stripped down to something more honest. He told me his firm had just closed its first profitable year. He told me he'd been in therapy every week since the day I confronted him, working through what he called a lifetime of choosing his father's approval over his own conscience. He told me he wasn't there to ask for anything. And then he asked anyway. I know I don't deserve a second chance, he said, his voice unsteady in a way I genuinely never heard from him. I'm not asking for one. I just need you to know that I love you. I loved you the whole time, even when I was too much of a coward to prove it. And I will spend the rest of my life being the man Grace deserves as a father, whether or not you ever let me be the husband you deserve again. I didn't answer him that day. I told him I needed time. He nodded, like he'd expected nothing else, and walked away without pushing, which, more than anything he'd said, told me something had genuinely changed in him. The weeks after that conversation were some of the most confusing of my life. I found myself, against my own better judgment, thinking about him constantly, not the man who'd let the papers arrive without warning, but the man in the park, stripped of his father's money and his father's name, asking for nothing but honesty. I talked to Priya about it more times than I can count. She, ever protective, was cautious. I just need to know he's not going to fold the second his father waves a checkbook at him again, she said, and I told her I needed the exact same proof. So I tested it, quietly, over the following months. I watched how he handled it when Richard reportedly reached out once more, dangling a partial reconciliation and a return to the family business if Daniel would simply reconsider his priorities. Vivian told me, in one of our now regular visits, that Daniel had turned his father down flat, told him that Elena and Grace weren't a phase he'd grown out of, and that if Cole Properties needed a Whitfield merger to survive, it could survive without him. It was a small dinner, 6 weeks after the park conversation, that changed things. Daniel had Grace on his lap, feeding her mashed peas with a patience that made me quietly, helplessly proud, and he looked up at me over her head and just smiled, not performing anything, not trying to win me back in that moment, just present, just there. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched tight for over a year. Maybe, I told him that night, as he was leaving. Maybe we try. Slowly. No promises beyond that. He nodded, and for the first time since the day those papers arrived, I saw real, unguarded relief on his face. Even as we began, carefully, to rebuild something, one piece of the story still didn't sit right with me. I needed to understand, fully, why Daniel had chosen silence over honesty in the first place, why a man who claimed to love me had let me find out I was both pregnant and abandoned on the very same morning. He finally told me the whole truth on a night Grace had fallen asleep between us on my living room floor. Richard, it turned out, had discovered the Whitfield merger opportunity nearly 2 years into our marriage and had spent that entire time quietly grooming Daniel toward it. Small comments about strategic partnerships, pointed remarks about how the company's survival depended on Daniel growing up and thinking bigger than personal feelings. Daniel admitted he'd resisted for over a year, genuinely believing he could find another way to save the company without sacrificing our marriage. But 3 months before the papers arrived, Cole Properties had come within weeks of bankruptcy, A bankruptcy that would have taken down not just Richard's fortune, but the retirement savings of dozens of long-time employees, including men and women who had known Daniel since he was a child. Richard had presented it to him as a binary choice: file for divorce quietly, secure the merger, save 80 jobs and his mother's financial security, or refuse, and watch it all collapse, including, eventually, whatever life Daniel and I might have tried to build on the wreckage. I told myself I was protecting you from the fallout, Daniel said quietly. But the truth is I was a coward. I should have told you everything and let us face it together. Instead, I tried to make the decision for both of us, and I broke us doing it. It didn't excuse what he'd done. But for the first time, I finally understood the shape of it, not an absence of love, but a catastrophic failure of courage. Those are not the same thing. They're also not that far apart. Understanding the truth didn't mean I was finished being angry. That confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't quiet like the ones before it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, Grace napping in the other room, when I finally let out everything I'd been holding since that morning 14 months earlier. I told him what it felt like to sign for divorce papers with a positive pregnancy test still in my other hand. I told him about the nights on modified bed rest with no husband to hold my hand, the calls he didn't answer, the 2-word texts that came 2 hours too late. I told him I had built an entire new life out of the wreckage he left behind, and that some nights I resented him for making me strong instead of simply loving me enough that I never had to be. He didn't defend himself. He sat there and took every word, and when I finally ran out of things to say, tears streaming down both our faces, he said the only thing that mattered: "You're right. About all of it. I don't need you to forgive me on any timeline but your own. I just need you to know I see exactly what I did, and I am never going to ask you to pretend it didn't happen." It wasn't a magic fix. There is no version of this story where one conversation erases 14 months of grief. But it was the first time I felt like Daniel was standing in the wreckage with me instead of asking me to sweep it under a rug so we could move forward faster than I was ready for. I told him I needed him to understand something clearly. I would never again build my safety on his promises alone. Only on what he actually did, day after day, when no one, not his father, not his mother, not even me, was watching to grade him on it. Just when it seemed like the hardest parts were behind us, one more piece of the story surfaced, the kind of twist I never saw coming. Vivian called me one evening, her voice tight with something between fear and fury. Richard, she said, had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition months earlier and had kept it from the entire family, choosing instead to pour his remaining energy into salvaging the company through the very merger that had cost Daniel his marriage. Now, weakened and facing a major surgery with real risk attached, Richard had finally reached out, not with another ultimatum, but with something that sounded, for the first time in his life, like regret. Daniel went to see him alone. He came back to my apartment hours later, quiet in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and told me his father had apologized clumsily, incompletely, in the stiff language of a man who'd never practiced the words, for pushing him toward a decision that cost him his family. Richard admitted that watching Daniel walk away from the company and rebuild something of his own, smaller but entirely honest, had forced him to confront choices in his own life he'd never had the courage to examine. It would have been easy, satisfying even, for this story to end with Richard simply cast as the villain, punished and gone. But the truth was messier than that. Richard's illness had cracked something open in him, and whatever reconciliation Daniel chose to offer his father was, ultimately, Daniel's decision to make, not mine. I told Daniel that. I told him I couldn't dictate his relationship with his father, only guard the one between him and me and our daughter, fiercely, from ever being sacrificed to it again. The hardest decision of this entire story wasn't whether to keep the baby, or whether to confront Daniel, or even whether to let him back into my life in small, careful steps. The hardest decision came later, quieter, and it was entirely mine to make alone. Daniel asked me to remarry him. Not with a grand gesture. He'd learned enough, by then, to know I didn't want a performance. He asked simply one evening, sitting on my kitchen floor while Grace stacked blocks between us, if I would consider building a family with him again, properly this time, with nothing hidden and no father's approval standing between us. I sat with that question for 3 full weeks before I answered it. I made lists. I talked to my mother, who told me love given a second chance isn't automatically foolish, but it has to be earned, not assumed. I talked to Priya, who reminded me that I didn't owe anyone, not Daniel, not Vivian, not even Grace, a reunion I wasn't fully ready for just because it made for a tidier story. What I decided, in the end, wasn't really about Daniel at all. It was about the woman I'd become over those 14 months, the woman who'd built a life, a career, a home, entirely on her own strength. I realized I wasn't choosing between being alone and being with Daniel. I was choosing whether the man in front of me now, humbled and honest and finally free of his father's leverage, deserved a place inside the strong, whole life I had built without him. I told him yes. Not because I needed him. Because, for the first time, I genuinely wanted him, as an equal, not a rescuer, not a risk. That distinction, I told him, would matter more than any ring ever could. There is a kind of justice that doesn't come from courtrooms or apologies, and I found most of mine there in the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding. Richard survived his surgery, and in the years that followed, he and Daniel built a slow, imperfect relationship, one where Daniel no longer needed his father's approval to know his own worth, which, I came to believe, was its own form of karma. The sun finally standing taller than the shadow that had once controlled him. Cole Properties eventually completed its merger, on terms that no longer involved my marriage as a bargaining chip, and Daniel's own firm grew steadily beside it, entirely independent, entirely his. Caroline Whitfield, as it turned out, had never wanted the arranged courtship any more than Daniel had. She married someone of her own choosing 2 years later, and sent, of all things, a kind note when she heard about Grace's birth. It was a small, unexpected Grace note in a story that could easily have stayed bitter. As for me, the justice I needed most wasn't Richard's comeuppance or Daniel's redemption. It was simpler than that. It was standing in my kitchen one ordinary Tuesday evening, watching my daughter smear spaghetti sauce across her father's shirt while he laughed instead of flinching, and realizing that I had built exactly the life I once feared I'd never get to have. Not because I waited for someone to hand it to me, but because I had refused to fall apart when it was taken away. That, more than any apology, was the closure I had been looking for all along. Grace turned 2 on a warm Saturday in June, and we celebrated in the backyard of the house Daniel and I bought together the year before, a modest place, nothing like the house we'd sold in the divorce, but entirely, deliberately ours. My parents were there. Priya was there, holding her own newborn son, teasing me about how we'd both ended up exactly where we needed to be, just by different roads. Vivian sat in a lawn chair, watching her granddaughter chase bubbles across the grass, tears in her eyes that had nothing to do with sadness. Daniel found me in the kitchen while I was cutting the cake, and he wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder the way he used to in the earliest, easiest days of our marriage. "Do you ever think about that morning?" he asked quietly. "The papers and the test, both on the same day?" I did think about it, more often than I let on. I thought about the woman I'd been that morning, terrified, betrayed, certain her whole life had just been detonated in a single hour. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her something. I wanted to tell her that the worst morning of her life was also, impossibly, the beginning of the strongest chapter of it. "I think about it," I told him, turning around in his arms. "I think about how scared I was. And I think about how none of this, not one piece of it, would exist without that fear forcing me to become someone stronger than I knew how to be." Outside, our daughter shrieked with laughter as a bubble popped against her nose, and for the first time in a very long time, I let myself simply stand still inside a happiness I had fought hard enough to finally trust. If you take one thing from Elena's story, let it be this: the worst day of your life is not always the end of your story. Sometimes it's the door your strength was waiting behind. Elena didn't survive that year because a man came back and fixed everything. She survived it because she refused to let abandonment define her. She built a home, a career, a village of people who showed up when it counted, and a love for her daughter so fierce it carried her through nights she didn't think she'd make it through. Daniel's return wasn't a rescue. It was a choice she made from strength, not scarcity, and that difference is everything. If you are sitting right now in your own version of that bathroom floor, papers in one hand, a future you didn't plan for in the other, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need to have it figured out today. You do not need to forgive on someone else's timeline, and you do not need anyone to come back in order for your story to have a happy ending. Sometimes the happy ending is simply you, standing on your own 2 feet, discovering you were strong enough all along. Thank you for watching Elena's story. If it moved you, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of heartbreak, resilience, and the families we build against every single odd.